Welcome to the Global Discussion, discussions with creatives, leaders, and thinkers. My name is Simon Hodgkins, and today I'm joined by Marine Tanguy. Marine, you're very welcome to the show. I'm really excited to talk to you because we specialize in creatives and leaders and thinkers, and you're right in the sort of crosshairs of that visual, artistic endeavor. So rather than me maybe continue with an introduction for you, could you maybe share a little bit about who you are, what you do, and maybe how you sort of came into the world that you are now, which I think is fascinating. So over to you, Marine.
Well, thank you so much for having me on the show. I'm delighted to be here. So who am I is obviously, as we all know, always a big, wide question is the answer. But I feel what I'm very excited to be building, what I have been building over the past 10 years, is ultimately a pioneering company that would be the first talent agency in the art world and position the artist as central to society. In a world where we consume visuals all day, and the visuals we consume are primarily through the advertising world, digital world, the political world, but very little led by artists. Now, the problem is that if the core intent of imagery all day long, hundreds of them that you get exposed to, is mainly commercial, you can imagine the state of our brain. They're not in really good shapes as we speak. So we wanted to really replace the artists within that visual sector, and that meant not only building their reputation very effectively, but also integrating their art in all contexts. And that reopens what I call the visual sector, which is the public art side, the brand collaboration, digital collaborations you can do with artists, the entertainment collaborations you could do with artists, and of course, the art sales, the museum and institutions. As a person, values-wise, I care deeply about equality, and I care deeply about equality to chances and opportunities. And that's the reason we were the first B Corp of the art world. I also care, I get addicted to talent. I like vision, I like ambition, I like that the optimism that you will get from very ambitious people. And I feel I get excited to ultimately be the person that can support the same people and put resources behind them. I also still am a kid in a sense that I love magic. I love transforming places. I found that the medium of art for this is incredibly effective in transforming the places that you'll be walking around and approaching. So that will be all my interests as a person. We spoke about it before the podcast, but I grew up in a tiny island off the west coast of France. Definitely more birds than people, 9,000 people total during the year. But I think I always say that for me, this upbringing, I was surrounded by beauty. I was in nature. It was a beautiful place. And that's very much now that I live in the center of London, now that our HQ is in the center of London, and that one out of two people will be living in cities by 2050, I feel that that exposure to inspiring visual environment is something that I took from my childhood and stayed with me, that I feel all places deserve that. And we should all be exposed to this, because I think it really shaped me.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Marine. And of course, living and growing up where you did, Marine is such a beautiful name. So it's great to have that link, and obviously being surrounded with that sort of beautiful environment, and that transitioning into today's visual world, where you're right, we are bombarded with many visuals today, particularly in a commercial setting. But I wanted to ask, if I can, with MTArt, you must have to review an awful lot of portfolios. You must be looking at a lot of different artists. What's that actually like, the mechanics of that behind the scenes? Is it as busy as I would assume it is?
Yeah, it's definitely busy. Over 200 applications a month, sometimes more, sometimes slightly less. And ultimately, we have a selection committee. We have a team that reviews the portfolio. I mean, you're always scouting. I think when you care about talents, you're always scouting for the top ones. They are really like rare diamonds. I think if you were speaking to a VC, they would be saying the same thing. Like they always is that magical moment where you encounter someone and you think, wow, that person is just they've got it all. Like they lack resources, they lack support, but the rest is sorted. They have the vision, they have the resilience, they have the ambition, they have the depth of content. They have the ability to reinvent themselves and progress forward, and they're obviously very talented. That's actually quite rare. And I think behind me there's a sculpture of Raven de Klerk, who is 27 and is the youngest woman to date to have ever got 3 permanent sculptures public commissioned in a public space, and who's been killing it this year. I met Raven when she was 22, just out of school, and that deal, for instance, is over 2 million. It's a game changer of a deal at her age, and yeah, that first cup of tea I knew. It was on a Saturday morning. I still remember it, and I just was completely convinced that Raven will become massive. So you do, it takes a lot to be that kind of talent, and there's a lot of compromises that go with it. And I think there's a type of people that is acceptant of what it takes to get there.
And I think what you've touched on there is something that I know you believe passionately, which is where a lot of galleries would focus on selling art on walls, but you really do support the artist, don't you, in terms of how you work with them and help them to achieve those sort of commercial and cultural endeavors.
Yeah, I think my relationship with objects is one that is connected via people, in a sense that I ultimately see the object as just a manifestation of the vision of someone. As a person, I think it's interesting because we always think of the Vanitas painting for the art world, which is like acquiring tons of objects. I think I've always been more tied to storytelling. I was never that person that used to acquire loads of objects. It's not in me. In fact, when I was broke and started my company, I was very much living out of a suitcase, and that didn't disturb me to have very little in terms of objects. So I think my connection with objects is because I invest in what I think are the top talents, and that's how I ended up collecting art later, and that's why I backed them. So by that definition of having a very different relationship than the traditional one with objects, I think we shifted away from looking at art as a visual narrative, a storytelling, and ultimately human beings that can push forward those visions. But as a person, I was already like this. I feel that was my connection with the arts in the first place.
Yeah, thank you, Marine. And I wanted to ask you a little bit on that, because you've kind of hinted at, you sort of mentioned the VC world, and you're kind of looking at lots of artists, and you're looking for that thought leader, that inspirational thinker, somebody who's different. And as you say, they can be very rare, to find and to spot in the wild, if I can use that phrase. And of course, it's very exciting when you find that fit. But you didn't start off here. I know you did a little spell with the BBC, but then you went into sort of managing galleries, didn't you? And you kind of worked your way to where you are today, and you've been successfully running MTArt now, I think, since 2015, if I'm right in saying that. So what was that journey like? Did you always have this burning passion to develop your own agency, to develop your own sort of art enterprise? What was the driving factor behind that? Or was you just destined to end up where you are now?
I mean, that all these things are so tied. You would never get to know exactly what was the biggest driving force. I feel the interest and the curiosity is definitely there. I'm endlessly curious, but about anything. I found loads of things really interesting. In fact, I got back into ballet this year, and I'm now at 3 times a week, and I found everything really interesting. I am that kind of person that shows enthusiasm for things in depth for a very long time. And I don't even go through phases, because by the second that spark is there, then I'm there for years, So it's I think the arts was this for me, where I found it fascinating. I found this, 65% of us are visual learners more than verbal thinkers. And I think I was probably one when I was younger. I found that words were clumsy, words were tend to only put a part of what I was trying to convey. And I found that the visual arts were conveying it much more effectively. So I think, yes, my connection with the arts was from the start. I think in terms of professional experience, I think something that I think I have as a skill to this day is I identify what an opportunity looks like, which is I kind of one your main core skill set should be as a CEO, I think, is comprehending what is an opportunity and what is not. And I think probably a talent is probably in the same position. And usually opportunities never come at the perfect timing. When I was offered my first investment into building that gallery in Los Angeles, or even my first managing role when I was 21, I was too young for it. I lacked experience, but I could see that this was such a huge opportunity that not accepting it will be the madness of it all. Me having to go through the steep learning curve of it was better than refusing something that could be life-changing. And I think I've retained the attitude where, you know, my Penguin publishing deal was offered to me as I was to give birth of my second, which was definitely not the perfect timing. But I've retained always that understanding that if something like this is coming your way, you just make it work. Because you know that ultimately this is where things really step up, is when you say yes to the right opportunities. So that first part of my career, I just seized opportunities. And then the second part, I just built the company on the values I really wanted to do from the experience I had first acquired.
And I mean, it's wonderful to hear that, because I know that you really are supporting, growing, promoting artists. But the agency today, it's a very successful enterprise in terms of, if we look at it in sort of more commercial terms, in terms of the money, in terms of the revenue that the organization supports. But you're also known as an organization that can bring these really talented, forward-thinking artists into the world and helping them to become visual. But you also work with brands, don't you? And you work with a number of brands. How does that work? What's the mechanics of that?
Building a reputation is always 360, and I know this is now used by every single agency under the sun, but it basically means that, you know, an artist needs large audiences, needs credibility, and needs revenue streams. That's all we build. You know, we build revenue streams, we build that credibility, we build those audiences. Audiences are everywhere. I think that culture is in every corner, is on the underground, is at the bus stop, it's at a football match, it's everywhere. I am not of the position that my sector took for a long time, that culture, the high culture was only in one place. For me, culture is everywhere. And I want to make sure that therefore the most inspiring artists are integrated to that everyday culture, because I value everyday culture. And I think that is what shapes everything, the way we look at the world, the way we feel. And I was also having that issue with the traditional sector, because it was saying that ultimately culture is only something that we should consume once every month and a half. I wanted to consume it every day. I wanted to be part, in fact, of my everyday and how I kind of approach the world. So we just looked at the everyday and went on to integrating the arts and all components of it. But again, I think it's also because we felt we're not better people bringing you what's wonderful. We also want to make sure we're in conversation with the everyday and learning from the culture on the ground. So it's not me being above and bringing you what's great. It's more ultimately being on the ground every single day, fed up, like very much feeding yourself off from that culture and contributing to it with artists that you adore.
That's wonderful. And just for our audience, you know, watching or listening to us around the world, I just want to mention a couple of things here, because just so people know, like you were awarded, you know, with Forbes, they do this 30 under 30. You were part of that. You're awarded that by Forbes, which is a huge recognition. But you were also the Art and Culture UK Entrepreneur of the Year. You were the NatWest Awards. It's a big bank over this side of the world. The NatWest Awards and Woman of the Year, only a few short years ago, by the magazine. Is it WOTC? I think they're acronym.
Yeah, correct.
You've also done TED Talks, and you mentioned earlier the book, and I want to come back to the book as well. Can you tell us a little bit about Visual Detox and working with Penguin and how all that works. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. I mean, firstly, I have been very lucky. I think Forbes was very much the most meaningful one. It's actually quite sweet because I still remember we were in New York with my husband, and I just, I'm very lucky to be loved now by Will for over almost soon to be 10 years, so about the same time as a company. And it's he really wanted me to get it. I think it was more from him than it was from me, because he really felt that ultimately we would deserve as a company to be on this. And being more in the tech sector, he was seeing loads of people being on this and less on the art side. But he therefore scrolled through, because the New York and London time was slightly different, and it was a European Forbes. He scrolled through without telling me, and he told me, because I was one of the latest, because my surname is always one of the latest, he scrolled through with so much anxiety until he could actually reach me, and apparently he was holding his breath that whole time. So I'm always quite emotional when thinking about this, because it was that little bit of confidence that he believed I needed, and I think he was right. It gave me that thinking that I could do it. And I think there's always things for all of us that are different. For me, that was that little push that says you are on the right direction, because let's not forget that disrupting a sector means you might not always be liked at all times. You might be quite challenged with it. And Forbes gave me that little thing of, you're on the right track, keep going, which sometimes you need to hear, especially in the early days. Going back to the book feels, again, quite existential, in the same way that Forbes, because it was a way to articulate our vision. And again, on the disrupting side, you're rarely fully understood. You are always seen as quite threatening, and therefore not always liked, and not always kind of seen for the full vision that you're trying to bring. And as you've heard, for us, the values and how we see the sector is very much why we get up in the morning as a team. So it feels really special to ultimately be trusted by Penguin, which is by far my favorite publisher. It was my number one. I wanted Penguin. It was definitely. I actually am so pleased I got one. It's really funny, because I never thought I would get my number one choice, and I'm still humbled that I got my number one choice, because they were very much my number one. And therefore, I think through this, it's articulating that out of hundreds of thousands of images that you see every day, what is the place of the arts? And most importantly, like, do you really want to be in a society where most of what you look at every single day is making you feel utterly miserable? I'm going to give you one study to just spark this thinking. The University of Warwick led a study just under 1 million people, and the higher the ad spent, the higher they got exposed to that commercial imagery across 27 European countries, the more miserable they are. Happiness is so tied to imagery. And yet we don't teach visual critical thinking. We don't teach visual education. We're surrounded by them. They shape us. Like, you go see that image and you're like, oh, I don't look that good today anymore. Or I need to buy that dress. Like, you don't really need to rush to Zara ever to buy an urgent top, right? But the feeding of the advertising that we get and the visual narratives tells us we must absolutely strive on that lifestyle. We must be that lifestyle, and that's how we will reach our happiness. And of course we don't. But I think therefore arts has a very special place in this, especially in light of the many challenges ahead of us in the climate change crisis, that, we need to reshape what are the values we want to see on a visual narrative level, and how do we insert it on our commute to work, on our everyday existence? What do we make of it? And I think that's a reflection on this.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Marine. It's such important pieces, and I'll come back to something that you said a moment ago that reminded me of a question I want to ask you. But before I do that, the other thing I wanted to talk about is, because I know some of your TED Talks, you've been talking about how art can transform cities.
Yeah.
And you also mentioned earlier, as we were talking, the amount of people that will just end up living in this urban sprawl, the city life. How important is art now? Is it more important now than it's ever been, particularly as we're all dwelling in cities? Maybe we're working a lot more remotely than we used to. But art and our relationship with art, has it changed? Did the pandemic change things? Did we reevaluate what was important?
It's really interesting because art is seen, and this is why I always use the visual sector, because we live in the visual world, and unless we're blind, we're part of it, but we don't take part in the art world, and that's the difference for me in that sense. But I feel I was just at the launch of the Arts and Impact report of McKinsey on Monday evening, and it's a thriving sector. It's actually one of the biggest sector in the UK, and what makes, for instance, this country completely thriving is through its cultural sector. That's in terms of growth, it's in terms of jobs, it's in terms of the many opportunities it creates, and yet it's something poorly understood, barely integrated to our school curriculum, and always left to the side. Like, to give you an idea, like, we are running up, and sorry, this is a very UK focused anecdote again, but we're running up towards the elections. We've already worked out how much VCs who are in tech will receive money-wise from the Conservative and Labour. We have absolutely no ideas on any of the policies, the cultural side. And yet, when you look at how little we give and the outcome that comes from the sectors, economic growth included, is huge. And it's actually currently, and that's what McKinsey was saying, outperforming the tech sector for the input of investment that goes in and the output. And I highly encourage, therefore, for everyone to look at the report that just came out on the 20th of November this year by McKinsey. And I think that's in many ways in which I think visual education is undermined on a constant basis. I was undermined through my entire education. It was seen as something pretty and decorative and fluffy and sweet that we're doing on the side. Again, like, this doesn't apply to any hard data. The hard data I gave you, that 65% of us are visual learners more than verbal learners, shows that most of us connect better with visuals than words. The fact that, therefore, the visuals, the way they communicate to the brain, they travel much faster, they impact us much faster than words. All these reasons, especially in the rise of AI as well, where we need that visual critical thinking, should be all reasonings to why we'd be like, let's invest in visual education. Let's really make sure we have a strong creative, cultural, and art sector. But it's it's always the afterthought. When I did my TED talk on public art and my academic paper on the same topic, at the time when you were Googling smart cities, art was nowhere to be found. All of this thing shows that it's an afterthought. Now, this is the reason, again, I did that book, and why I'm encouraging of initiative like the McKinsey one, because the data shows the opposite. The data is clear. For well-being is much better, for economic growth is much better, for the way in which we interact with the world, we must be visuals. There's absolutely nothing that says that it's a tiny minority of people in a corner of the room. This is something that is touching all of us. So the more we communicate with that data, I hope the more people realize that this is something that we should really pay more attention to.
Yeah, and I think it's fascinating what you said, because you mentioned AI as well. And I think in this generative world that we're living in now, where there's just stuff being churned out all the time, the appreciation of art and the benefits that we get from it, and the cultural resonance that we get from it, and the importance of that in a visual, I suppose, learning style, if I can use that phrase, it seems to be really, really critical right now. And you're right. I remember a time when, it was very hard to see any investment in public art, public infrastructure that had artistic, it was built to the cheapest grade materials, it was an afterthought, to your point. I think there has been some change there, but it still seems like there's an awful long way to go here, Marine.
Yeah, and I think it's why, again, like, I hope the book will be helpful in this, on giving methods to analyze imagery, giving little cues ultimately to how imagery is affecting us. Like, for me, it's also going beyond the constant conversation of, is social media bad for you? It's the content of that social media that's also the problem. Like, if you were on social media only watching in-depth documentary with 5 different experts, like, probably would not have the same impact that we have today. But we never want to discuss that visual content. 90% of the visual content you see on those platforms are advertising a skinny body and a lifestyle and a way of being. That is ultimately what we currently see. So it's important to be aware of this, because it's like the fish in the water. If you're not aware of it, you don't realize that's actually what shapes you. But all this thing shapes you. The advertising world knows it more than anybody else. They know, like Coca-Cola spends 4.2 billion in advertising every year and sells 1.8 billion products a day. They understand that they need to advertise to you visually with their red color as first as you start, walking. And that shows the power of colors, the power of the symbolic, the power of imagery. Like Coca-Cola, it's very much in 2 seconds. If I tell you red, you think red. If even our emojis, like if you look at the burger emoji, there's a McDonald's logo symbols. Like in 2 seconds, all those images are like shaping us, and they're shaping behaviors. Not being educated means we're going to be manipulated by it. As the rise of fake imagery also happens, it's even more manipulation coming into play, and I think that's very dangerous. We worried about misinformation when it was just words, and I put that in brackets because it was dangerous enough. But I think misinformation when it comes to visuals for me is much more scary.
Yeah, and it's so inspiring hearing you talk on this topic, because you're one of the people that are championing art and championing the sector, and I'm probably using the wrong phrase here, but it's like a welcome break. It's like fresh air. It's like pure oxygen from this bombardment that we have of our senses from the commercialization of imagery. So it's so refreshing and inspiring to hear you talk. I do want to squeeze in something that I said I'd come back to, which is I think you're also involved a little bit in the COP24 discussion, aren't you?
Yeah, so COP is coming up again this year. I should just open this week. For me, like I will be giving a keynote speech on, again, how do we shift our visual narrative with nature? I mean, at a highlight, it's, we spoke slightly a little bit about it earlier, but it's the bombardment of a certain type of lifestyle has also made us believe that therefore it's our lifestyle against nature. And we see it, maybe you remember when Andrew Tate, the influencer, was clashing with Greta Thunberg. Every time she was saying something that was sustainably led, he was sending those images of like fast cars and like jets and all of this. That's because it's always in a power dynamic. It's because men have always wanted to, whether it's own nature or if they couldn't, they will feel it's a power dynamic with it. So that monstrous nature that could create a shipwreck or that could create storms. So I think that common narrative, again, reconnecting us emotionally away from the lifestyle and with nature is going to be quite key to think of the next steps with ultimately all the challenges that are ahead of us. So it's again thinking and analyzing of imagery to this date and how we've communicated about this issue and suggesting steps for me and how do we change that.
Well, you're certainly busy, that's for sure, Marine. You've got an awful lot happening all the time. It's great to see. It's so, as I said, it is inspiring and encouraging to hear from, somebody that really values this and understands the topic as well as you do. I want to ask you if I can just change gears a little bit, because I don't want to run out of time. I want to squeeze in a couple of extra questions before we do come to a close here.
Yeah.
We're at the time of recording. People are thinking about the next year. What are their plans for the next 6 months, 12 months, 18 months? How does it work for somebody in your line of work? What are you like from a planning perspective? Do you take each day as it comes? Are you a meticulous planner? What's on your roadmap? What's on your horizon? How do you go about organizing that in your world?
That's a very interesting question. I am definitely the founder and therefore CEO who is a starter and a finisher, which means that ultimately the middle planning is where I will be failing short, and where my lucky COO is much better than I can be incredibly philosophical and vision driven, but I'm also a very day-to-day person. Is that in between, therefore, that I don't master. And that's like, as I speak to you this morning, I still succeed to squeeze ballet for now. And doesn't matter how my day will unfold and how highs and lows and everything, I insert my routine time with my kids, things that makes me happy as part of my routine, even when there's loads of big things happening. And that's my day to day. And that makes me very grounded because it feels that therefore you have control on what matters most to you. And then the rest obviously is completely out of your control, but it also means that therefore you can respond better to that flux of information because you can take the highs and lows better. And therefore with the vision, I think luckily the vision has never changed. So I think it, I've been able to build towards that vision. But I think, again, I believe in that discipline of the everyday to build towards it. And I turn up to work, I show up every single day, I put the same amount of work for the past, God knows how many years at this point. And I think I also therefore insert joy in the everyday in whatever format, so that even very busy period, very stressful periods still have those nuggets of time with people that you love and things that you love doing as well. And that in itself is less of a planning, it's more of a coping mechanism. But at this stage of my life, I think if I am a happy, striving person that will feed off my company culture, that would ultimately make me turn up the best possible way to represent the company and attend to the vision that we want to give it. So I think a coping mechanism is probably more important than a pure planning way of doing things.
I love that. Thank you for sharing that, Marie. Look, finally, is there anything else that you would like to share with our international audience today? And secondly, and really importantly, if people want to find out more about the work that you do, the book and everything else that's going on in your world, where is the best place to point people to?
So as you know, I'm very active on the communication level. I would always recommend Instagram or LinkedIn because I think it's nice to follow the journey or the stories of companies or the funders, because it gives you that little human feeling of why they're building what they're building. It also gives you an insight onto the shiny updates because you see the daily as well. So highly recommend, if you type my name or the one of the company, you can either go company side or you can go through me. But I will give you the behind the scenes of how ultimately the company is built on a day-to-day basis. Things I want people to know. You know what? I'm going to leave you with a thought as a female founder that I think sadly still has to be reminded, which is that right now for £1 going into investment in Europe, so therefore more €1, 85p goes to 4 male teams or one man leading the company. 14p goes to a co-founder that's male and a co-founder female. Only 1p go to female funder. That I think is something that we know and quite aware, that therefore your chances to fundraise, especially in recession, are even less so. But I'm going to pile up a second fact, which is that in the same bracket, if you are a single female funder, you have 120% chances more to be attacked online. And that's something that is happening nonstop for the past few years, that for the first time, Emma Bennington on The Guardian wrote about it last year, saying that it creates for young girls, they're becoming less ambitious because they're scared. There's a backlash against female leaders, plus you also have less chances on the financial side to get there. This is heartbreaking because ultimately, I've been passed the baton by so many generations who've been fighting for this. And bear in mind that I'm in the privileged category. I'm in the white population of this from a middle-class background. So I really should be in the nicest category of that 1p. But the fact that it's 1p and that you have so much risk of being attacked and so much pressure, even the media, there's a Harvard Review did a brilliant piece on the objectives used when it comes to female funders versus male funders. This is something that's still present on a day-to-day basis. And the thing is like, between the attacks and the fundraising, we are really struggling to convince women to want to do what we're doing. So we need help on really thinking awareness-wise, what are the current biases? How do we break them? How do we reframe them? And bearing that in mind, as this is still a very appalling stats on the ground.
Well, that is a lot of very thoughtful points to leave our audience with. There's an awful lot in that and so much work left to do. And I think some of the points that you've made there when you just pause for a moment and reflect on it, it's staggering, isn't it? What you've said. It is, you
Yeah.
know, to believe
Well,
that
it's
we're,
heartbreaking because that one
yeah,
P is, like I mentioned, is likely to be mostly privileged girls as well, of middle class background and white like me. So this is the problem. Is also doesn't even touch your social economics of underprivilege. It's a ridiculous stat, and it's very discouraging. And we can't ask young girls to be motivated enough. We need society to change as they ultimately try and do things. And I can understand if someone might not want to go ahead with it because that sounds scary. So we need to facilitate a much better place for them to build companies in.
couldn't agree more. And thank you so much indeed for raising those points and for spending some time with me here today on the global discussion. It does bring us nicely to the end of this episode. I want to thank, if I can, everybody around the world who's been watching or listening to this episode. Make sure that you follow, like, subscribe, do everything I need you to do to help support the podcast. Go and check out everything that Marine's involved with too. And I hope that you'll join me back here for some more discussions with creatives and leaders and thinkers just like Marine. Marine, it's been a real pleasure to spend some time with you again today, my friend.
Well, thank you so much for having me.